Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. Just to this final retail webinar on endpoint assessment. Some of you I know have been dialing into my previous two, so nice to see you back. And I'm being supported today by my colleague Jay Crowther, who is from our marketing team. So any questions, again, pop them in the question box and we will answer them either throughout the session as written or during the session as verbal answers. And as was mentioned in the overview just there, obviously you will be getting a copy of this presentation at the end or early part of next week. So what are we looking at today? So endpoint assessment. So we're looking at endpoint assessment organizations, who they are, what they're supposed to do. Preparation for endpoint assessment, again, it's been highlighted in the previous two webinars, but again, looking at how you prepare a candidate for endpoint assessment. Looking at the details of the endpoint assessments and looking at the details of the retail assessments in the level 2, 3, and 4. Looking at the costs of endpoint assessment, because again, this is an important element for most of you and something that you are concerned about. And finally, looking at external quality assurance and the role that, and I apologise, I'm getting my offs mixed up. Ofqual, it should actually be Ofsted. So the external quality assurance role, Ofqual role, and I will also cover Ofsted because again, that is important to you. Okay, so endpoint assessment organisations. Who, what, why, where, when, and how. Hopefully not in that order. So this endpoint assessment organisation is, as I've mentioned in previous presentations, is the independent element of the apprenticeship training programme. So a candidate has gone through their 12 months minimum on programme training and assessment, and it is now an independent organisation that is going to confirm alongside the employer that that candidate is occupationally competent. So there needs to be a list of endpoint assessment organisations, and the Skills Funding Agency have a register of approved endpoint assessment organisations. Anybody can apply to become an endpoint assessment organisation. The clear differentiation between training and assessment has to be maintained. So if you are planning to deliver apprenticeships and you're also planning to deliver endpoint assessment, you won't be able to necessarily deliver your own endpoint assessment unless you can demonstrate clear separation between the two different companies. So your training arm and your assessment arm need to be very separate, and this needs to be clearly documented in your application as an endpoint organisation. There are two registers. So there's an overarching register which shows all endpoint assessment organisations that are approved. And then there's a second register which appears to have disappeared off the website or been merged with the first at any rate, which shows the standards for which that endpoint assessment organisation is approved for. Now this is currently a CSV downloadable file off the government website, and the link is above that, but again I will be sending it out after these presentations, so you can actually search to see who is approved for which standard. The register opens on a monthly basis, and as new occupations are approved by the Institute for Apprenticeships, these occupations are then added to the list of endpoint assessment organisations. So you only have to apply once to go onto the register of organisations, but you have to apply for each individual occupation that you wish to offer. So if you're looking at a large number of occupations, then it can be quite time consuming. What I would suggest if you are considering becoming an endpoint assessment organisation is to look very carefully at the requirements in the assessment plan. The assessment plan will stipulate the requirements for an endpoint assessment organisation and also stipulate the requirements for any independent endpoint assessors that they may need to be used. I would also consider the fact of who the external quality assurance organisation is. If this is Ofqual, then you will need to ensure that as an endpoint assessment organisation that you can adhere to Ofqual's conditions of recognition. You don't necessarily have to become an awarding organisation, but you do have to be able to adhere to the conditions of recognition, because that is a requirement from Ofqual and they can be very difficult for a non-awarding organisation to understand. And as I said earlier, you need to be approved as an endpoint assessment organisation before you can be approved against a specific standard. And these these tests that you have, these applications you provide will look at capability as well as financial health and a number of other issues that they deem important. So as an endpoint assessment organisation, yes, we've gone through that pain. We're on the register for all 3 retail standards. So we are available to deliver endpoint assessment for the Retail 2, Retail Team Leader 3 and Retail Manager 4. Preparing for endpoint assessment. As I've said previously, this is a very critical stage in the process. This is where you follow this gateway process, which is a meeting between the employer, training provider and apprentice. It's where you review the requirements against the standard and the candidate's or the apprentice's performance against the requirements of the standard. Have they been met? Have they demonstrated full competence over a significant period of time in order to be classified as competent by that employer? If there is a portfolio of evidence required, again, not all endpoint assessments require a portfolio of evidence, but some do. Again, you'll be reviewing that to make sure that all of the required information is contained within that. And again, you have to remember that the portfolio evidence that is produced for endpoint assessment cannot have been assessed as part of on-programme in its entirety. Elements could have been assessed as part of on-programme formally, but as a whole document, the endpoint assessment portfolio of evidence cannot have been assessed in its entirety previously. The agreement that needs to be reached as part of this gateway process is that the candidate meets the requirements set out in the standard, so they have demonstrated ongoing full competence, and that the employer deems them occupationally competent. And if at that point either the employer or the provider do not agree that the apprentice is occupationally competent, then they should not be put forward for endpoint assessment, and areas for additional training should be identified and carried out prior to the endpoint assessment being started. As part of the gateway process, it's recommended that you look at a project proposal for the business project where this is a part of the endpoint assessment, and we'll come on to that in a moment. You'll then need to book your endpoint assessment with your endpoint assessment organisation. Now, at the beginning of an apprenticeship, you will select the endpoint assessment organisation you initially plan to work with as part of your application process or registration process on the ILR. This doesn't necessarily register them with the endpoint assessment organisation. This just lets the SFA know who you're planning to use for an endpoint assessment organisation. At that point, upon registration, you may wish to register with the endpoint assessment organisation where there may be a bundled offer of on-programme support materials. For example, in the last presentation I provided on on-programme, we're going to be having the Pearson Apprenticeship 360 online learning package programme, which will be available to learners as part of a bundled endpoint assessment offer. So you could register your apprentice with the assessment organisation at that point. Alternatively, you could wait until the end and then book them with that endpoint assessment organisation. What I would ask you to bear in mind is, though, obviously from a volume perspective in terms of apprentices to independent assessors, some endpoint assessment organisations may require a minimum booking period before endpoint assessment can actually take place, and also to ensure that you have the dates that you want your endpoint assessment to take place on and make sure that they're available. Bear that in mind, and if necessary, book in advance. So, as I mentioned previously, we are going to be having some support materials available for endpoint assessment for apprentices and potentially also for employers. So practice tests where there's a knowledge test as part of the endpoint assessment, preparations for observations, how an observation is carried out, because remember, there isn't a mandatory NVQ as part of an apprenticeship anymore, so on-programme or on-site observations being taken place in the workplace may not be carried out with as much frequency as they are currently, so an apprentice may not have had that experience of being observed. And for those of us that have been in apprenticeship delivery or work-based learning delivery for a number of years, we know how we can observe a candidate throughout the entire length of the NVQ, but if that candidate's been selected as part of the EV process to be observed, everything that could go wrong then does go wrong. So this is just to help an apprentice understand what an observation is and how to prepare for it. We also have a preparation guide for professional discussions or technical interviews or whatever the phrase is for this activity, and we also have a guidance on constructing portfolios of evidence where necessary. As I've said previously, these are non-sector specific, so these are standalone guides which any apprentice can pick up and read through and apply to their own sector. As I said earlier, some assessment organisations may ask for a minimum booking time. I would suggest you start looking at around month 9 into the apprenticeship programme, month 9, month 10, and start looking at starting to prepare the candidate for endpoint assessment. If the candidate at that point is starting to demonstrate frequent occupational competence, then this is where you would start to look at, okay, when are we going to book our endpoint assessment activity? Obviously, you can't carry the endpoint assessment activity out until at least 12 months and 1 day has passed of the on-programme element. But again, booking it in with the endpoint assessment organisation sooner rather than later will ensure that you get the dates that you require, because where there is an observation required, again, the candidate's going to want to be able to demonstrate occupational competence. And from a retail perspective, this could be that you don't necessarily want to assess or observe on a Monday morning, but a Thursday afternoon or a Friday afternoon could be perfect. So again, making sure that they're all scheduled in at the right time. So the details of the endpoint assessment, the nitty-gritty elements of it all. This is obviously a new part. This is trying to align it more to an academic style approach of assessment at the end, and not necessarily making it academic in terms of the style of assessment necessarily, but putting the emphasis on the training and delivery throughout the programme being assessed at the end by somebody who has no connection to that apprentice or has had no connection to the delivery of the on-programme element of that apprentice. There is an initial planning meeting that's with the apprentice and the employer and the independent end assessor, which sets out the stages of the endpoint assessment, and you schedule the dates for the observation and the professional discussion. They could potentially take place on the same day, but one has to follow the other. So you have to carry out an observation before you carry out a professional discussion. And again, if you have a business project as part of the endpoint assessment, so that's your retail team leader level 3 and your retail manager level 4, approving the project proposal. So the independent end assessor has seen the proposal submitted by the apprentice and has signed it off as suitable for a business project endpoint assessment activity. So as I said a moment ago, the endpoint assessment activities have to be carried out in a specific order from a retail sector. So the candidate has to sit and pass the knowledge test before they can undertake the practical observation or the retail business project, and the professional discussion has to come in last, and I'll explain the reasons why that is in a moment. Each element will be graded. Some cases it will be graded pass-fail, and some will be graded pass, distinction, fail. And each one of those is different. That will obviously then go forward to looking at the overall grading of the apprenticeship, and the assessment plans do state the grading profile tables to say what overall grade the candidate will come out at if they receive, for example, a pass in the multiple choice test, a merit in the observation, and a distinction in the professional discussion. What will the overall grade be? The independent assessor will carry out the moderation process to finalise the overall grade, and this is the independent assessor only, and they will submit this to their external endpoint assessment organisation, and that EPA organisation will inform the apprentice employer of the final grade, and they will then claim the apprenticeship certificate. If, and I say if as a hopeful if, there are any concerns or appeals that need to be made as part of an endpoint assessment organisation application, we need to have an appeals and complaints process and procedure available for candidates to follow. So again, that will be made available on registration for endpoint assessment. So I've just had a quick question before I go into the details of the endpoint assessment, saying EPA observations, will they be based on a specific task, e.g. delivery, customer service, taking payments, merchandising, or will this depend on their job role in the store? Correct. It will depend on the job role in the store. The candidate will be expected to be carrying out their normal day-to-day duties, and they will be observed during those normal day-to-day duties. Now, obviously, it would be better if the candidate was being observed during a relatively busy period so they could demonstrate a range of skills to the observer, such as customer service, such as problem solving, such as complaints handling, as could happen in this sector, such as working on the till, such as receiving or taking stock, making orders. Again, it will vary on the candidate and the store that they're working in and the role that they actually carry out. Ideally, yes, you would want to carry out the observation with that apprentice at the time when the candidate is able to demonstrate the largest range of skills that they have learnt and demonstrated throughout the on-program element. So, as I said a minute ago, the assessment plan details more information as to the endpoint assessment, and it also outlines things like the resit requirements as well. So within retail, and I mentioned this at the beginning because hopefully candidates will not need to undertake a resit, they are allowed 2 resits. But after the first resit, if the candidate has failed that element again, there is a minimum requirement of 1 month's further training and underpinning knowledge delivery to prepare the candidate for the second resit, and that's normally between 1 and 3 months worth of training requirements before the candidate can resit. So the first resit can take place as soon as the candidate feels they're ready, but the second resit has to take place no less than 1 month after the last resit opportunity. So we've had another question. What is the training provider not told the result directly from the endpoint organisation? You probably will be told in conjunction with the employer and the training provider. The funding that you receive, the 20% worth of funding that's paid, is actually paid on completion of the endpoint assessment, not necessarily on the achievement of endpoint assessment. So yes, once the candidate has completed the endpoint, then yes, you'll be known that they've completed and you can claim that remaining 20% if that's the question you're asking. But you will be informed probably via the system that the candidate has passed to the grade that they've achieved alongside the employer. And what happens if the planned observation cannot go ahead for one reason or another? Is there an opportunity to be rearranged? Yes, definitely. Things happen, and things do happen in all manners of situations. So yes, as long as the assessor is given plenty of notice, obviously illness happens, yes, they can be rearranged. That's not a problem. So looking at the details of the endpoint assessment for retail level 2. So there's a 30-minute multiple choice question paper, which is going to be online. It's graded pass fail, and they are, like I said, multiple choice questions, some of which will be scenario based. That's then followed by a 2-hour practical observation in the workplace. But like I said earlier, they have to pass their multiple choice questions before they can complete the observation. They then do the 2-hour observation, and it's then followed up by a professional discussion, which is 1 hour long. The requirements for both the observation and the professional discussion at pass and distinction levels are contained within the assessment plan. The professional discussion will also mop up, if you like, any elements of the observation that weren't directly observed as part of the observation because of the lack of opportunity to do so. So professional discussion is there to not only carry out assessment activities for certain elements of the apprenticeship standard, but also to cover anything else that was not necessarily picked up as part of the observation. So retail level 3, training retail team leader. Again, you have a multiple choice question paper. This is 60 minutes rather than 30, and again, it's also graded at pass fail. Multiple choice questions with scenario situations included. You then go on to a business project rather than an observation. So this is where the candidate identifies an immediate opportunity, problem, challenge, or idea that relates to their workplace and their retail environment. They have to identify potential cost savings or efficiencies, and they have to make recommendations as part of the business project and also have an implementation plan for this. This is then presented to the independent assessor and it is then discussed. That's then followed by, again, a 1-hour professional discussion that covers certain requirements of the apprenticeship standard. So the level 4 is a 2-hour written exam, and this will be short answer questions in the main. There may be some long answer questions as well, but this is graded pass, distinction and fail. Again, the retail business project is the same as set out in the retail team leader standard, but with the addition of a 3-year strategic plan, which also includes research, proposals and recommendations alongside an implementation plan. So a 3-year strategic plan for their retail environment or their place of work. And then followed by a 1-hour structured meeting. So again, like I said earlier, the grading for each element is within the assessment plan, and you can look to see how a candidate achieved a distinction and the emphasis placed on each of the 3 components of the assessment. So I've had another question come through that says, in terms of internal quality assurance, will independent endpoint assessors be self-moderating their own assessments, or will they pass the assessment's evidence to the Centre for IQA for final moderation? Also, how will standardisation happen now? Okay, so in terms of internal quality assurance is carried out by the endpoint assessment organisation. So if you were using Pearson as an endpoint assessment organisation, our independent end assessors will be supported by internal quality assurance activities that are carried out by Pearson, with Pearson staff on that. So the end assessments will in some respects be self-moderating, but again, they have this independent quality assurance backup. We also have our external quality assurance, which carries out the standardization process across not just all independent assessors, but all endpoint assessment organizations. So Pearson will carry out standardization activities and moderation activities as part of the independent quality or internal quality assurance. And the external quality assurance body, which I'll come on to in a moment, will carry out the external quality assurance standardization across endpoint assessment organizations to ensure that we are all working to the same set of criteria. Now, as endpoint assessment organizations, we do have further documentation that's available to us as endpoint assessment organizations, which sets out the minimum mandatory requirements of our endpoint assessment that we have to cover and that has to be covered and detailed. And that does include internal quality assurance. So yes, we are moderated quite heavily as an endpoint assessment organization by somebody externally, as well as obviously internally as well. So that's endpoint assessment. It seems quite straightforward, possibly will take, give or take, depending on availability of assessors and availability of candidates, bearing in mind the shift patterns that they may be working, up to 3 weeks, I would imagine, to carry out all of those activities. So within a month, a candidate from completing their on-programme delivery and assessment may have actually achieved their apprenticeship and completed their endpoint assessment. How much does this all cost? Because again, there has to be a cost to it. The government expect that the majority of costs are provided for on-programme delivery and assessment, but where we have large volumes of endpoint assessment and large requirements of endpoint assessment, then that can become quite costly. But you need to know exactly how much. So they do set out indicative costs in the assessment plan. So for example, I think it's retail manager, they stipulate that they expect it to be somewhere between 15 and 18% of the funding band. This is relating to an old funding band, of course, not necessarily the current one. But the Skills Funding Agency and the Institute for Apprenticeships have outlined that the costs should be no more than 20% of the overall funding band. So if you are looking at costing out to your delivery of apprenticeships at the moment and you don't know what your endpoint assessment costs are going to be, work it out on 20%, because that will give you a maximum figure that you need to spend on endpoint assessment. And obviously anything under that 20% is helpful to support your on-programme delivery costs, and especially your off-the-job delivery costs, as mentioned last week. As I said, resits are available, and that's 2 resits per learner per element. and if a learner needs 2 resits to pass their multiple choice test, I would look at whether they are able to carry out the observation or the business project at that point as well, and just see if you need to defer the date of carrying those out a little bit before they actually take them. They are costed separately. There will be a cost involved to resits, and you need to discuss this with the employer as part of your financial discussions. So if, for example, within retailer level 2, it's a £5,000 funding cap. So let's say £1,000, for sake of my maths, is spent on external endpoint assessment, and that you then spend the remaining £4,000 as part of your on-programme delivery, including your off-the-job, which is feasible. The candidate then fails the observation, because the observation is likely to be an expensive part of the and the professional discussion, the most expensive part of endpoint assessment. You'll need to agree with your employer who is going to pay for that resit cost. And if there is any funding available left in the levy pot or in the funding pot up to that cap of 5,000, then yes, it can come out of that. Alternatively, there may need to be a contingency amount set aside. But again, that's part of your contractual discussions that you have with your employer at the beginning of the apprenticeship. And as I've mentioned in previous weeks, the endpoint assessment costs will be variable on a number of learners and locations. If we can assess a number of learners on the same day, obviously the cost for this may be reduced. Likewise, we also have different models of delivery of endpoint assessment. So we have something called a partnership arrangement, where we look to work with you and your staff in delivery of endpoint assessment, which again can reduce your endpoint assessment costs. For more information on this, please do speak to your account manager for your centre, your Pearson account manager for your centre. Likewise, if you're also looking at using Pearson for endpoint assessments and you're looking for a more definitive cost than the 20%, again, speak to your account manager, let them know your numbers of learners on each level, because again, each level has a separate costing model, because again, the requirements are different for all 3, and we can add these into our calculations and provide you with an endpoint assessment cost. So we've had a question saying, are the professional discussions recorded and captured via voice recording or written? If the provider has ePortfolio, will they need to include on their system, or is it made available from the awarding organisation? Okay, so professional discussions can be carried out in a number of ways, one of which being face-to-face, another being Skype or some form of video conferencing facility. There is documentation that the independent assessor needs to retain. I'm not 100% sure as to whether whether there is a requirement for them to be voice recorded. It obviously would help in terms of appeals procedures in case they're needed. It's probably best practice that we do record professional discussions with the permission of everybody that's taking part in that professional discussion. And like I said, it will be kept separately. So if you have an ePortfolio system, no, you won't need to include it on your system, because again, this will be handled completely separately. Because obviously, although you can see the requirements for the endpoint assessment and you can support your candidates in preparing for endpoint assessment, obviously the documentation we produce has to be approved by our external quality assurance organisation. Will all the information from today be available and documented? This will help prepare the learner. Yes. So if at the end of today's session, if you haven't already, because I do have a list of people who have attended these previously, I do have your email addresses. I can then send out some information to you on all of this, and that's links to all the different standards, links to the endpoint assessment register and the training providers register, and so on and so forth. In terms of the endpoint assessment preparation materials, the support materials, they are available, but they are available for candidates who are preparing for endpoint assessment at the moment, once they have registered with their apprentices. So, external quality assurance and Ofqual, which should read Ofsted. So I do apologise. This was me trying to write my slides in a hurry and getting the two mixed up, as I normally do. So, External quality assurance. Yep, all endpoint assessments have to have an external quality assurance organisation listed. And if you look in the assessment plan, the most recent assessment plans have to stipulate who that external quality assurance organisation is going to be. If it doesn't at the moment for anything other than retail or other sectors, they will have to be being amended as we speak. A request in inverted commas gone out to all employer groups to say you need to amend your assessment plan to include additional elements to meet the current guidance, one of which being an external quality assurance organisation. So there are 4 options for an external quality assurance organisation, and this is decided by the employer group who create the assessment plan and the standard. So Ofqual being the first group. An employer body, so if an employer body wants to create an external quality assurance option, then they can do so. A professional or a trade body. And then finally, as a last point, as a last option at the moment, is Institute for Apprenticeships. What I would say is there are some assessment plans that don't have a stipulated EQA organisation that are going through endpoint assessment in the next few months. The Institute for Apprenticeships has stated that they will actually carry out the EQA role for these organisations as an interim measure whilst they are amending their assessment plans, so that actually candidates and endpoint assessment organisations are not disadvantaged. So if there isn't an EQA group listed and you are carrying out endpoint assessment activities in other sectors, then the IFA will be the EQA organisation for this first cohort of learners, with the expectation that the next cohorts of learners will have a permanent EQA organisation attached. So, like I said earlier in answer to another question, the main purpose of EQA is to carry out the standardisation and moderation of the EPA process. The EQA is not there to confirm grades. They are there to make sure that all EPA organisations are carrying out the EPA process and activities in the required manner, and that actually they are applying those processes and activities consistently. And between organisations, again, that they are being applied consistently, so that actually there is not an EPA organisation that can carry out something that is not to the same standard as the rest, which is potentially a slightly lower standard. Every EPA organisation has to adhere to the same set of rules and criteria. This is where I've made a mistake again, because Ofqual it should read Ofsted, so apologies. Ofsted will still be involved. So there has been questions in the past about what role does Ofsted have now, especially where there are employer providers who could be the lead. Ofsted will still be involved in inspecting those lead providers, as they currently do under SACE, and where necessary they may involve in that Ofsted inspection the inspection of subcontractors, and it does happen, not all the time I appreciate, but it does and has happened. You will only be going through an Ofsted inspection if obviously you are a lead provider, and that is whether you are a college, a private training provider, or an employer provider. If you are designated as a lead provider on the ILR system, you will be subject to Ofsted. And if you are issued a grade 4 as a result of that Ofsted, then your contract may be terminated and your continued delivery of apprenticeships may be withdrawn. So this is something to bear in mind, that again, if you are new to being a lead provider, this is the first year, for example, because you have a large volume or even a small volume of levy paying organisations that you're going to be working with. If you've never been Ofsteded before, again, I would strongly recommend that you look at the requirements for Ofsted inspections. They may change for apprenticeships. They haven't confirmed how and under what methodology they will be inspecting apprenticeship providers. But I would look at the standard common approach documents and use those as a baseline and prepare yourself accordingly. So in terms of external quality assurance and the retail sector, retail has set up a retail apprenticeship board to carry out the external quality assurance. This is managed by People First, who were previously the Sector Skills Council for the area and managed the SACE apprenticeship frameworks, and they're overseeing and the administrative function of this retail apprenticeship board. Now, this board's made up of 15 members from the sector. So again, if you have employers that want to be involved in apprenticeships more than just providing apprentices, then they can recommend or put themselves forward to be on this apprenticeship board. It will also contain a member from a private training provider. It will also contain a member from a college, and it will also contain a member of an endpoint assessment organisation, and these final three will rotate on an annual basis. The monitoring of providers, endpoint assessment associations, will be at least 10% of their provision. Now, if we operate across multiple sites, which is entirely possible from a retail perspective, then it will be 10% across all of our multiple site areas. So the sampling obviously is consistent across all organisations that offer EPA for apprenticeships, and that it will be applied, like I said, 10% overall or 10% of each sub-site or satellite site that we may actually use. Ofqual, because I've obviously mentioned the word Ofqual in here, in terms of Ofqual's role within apprenticeships where they're not an external quality assurance organisation, if there is a mandatory qualification within that standard that is a regulated qualification, Ofqual will still be involved in regulating that qualification. Likewise, unless as an endpoint assessment organisation, and we're an awarding organisation as well, it only applies to awarding organisations. If we don't surrender our endpoint assessment activity to Ofqual, they can still come in and audit us against the conditions of recognition for our endpoint assessment activities. We are looking to surrender our retail endpoint assessment activities because we feel that the quality assurance that we require will be covered by the Retail Apprenticeship Board. However, anything that we do produce will be in line with Ofqual's conditions of recognition as a backup, even though Ofqual will not be auditing us on it. We will still design everything with the conditions of recognition in mind, because as an awarding organisation, that is the minimum standard that we want to adhere to, be it apprenticeship delivery or regulated qualification delivery. So, whistle-stop tour of endpoint assessment. Obviously, as more details become available for endpoint assessment, obviously we'll be carrying out further webinars on this and with on-programme delivery as well. So keep your eyes open for email alerts from Pearson about future updates on the retail sector. As I said earlier, if you want to inquire more about the on-programme support and qualifications options, the endpoint assessment preparation materials or endpoint assessment costs, by all means, please speak to your Pearson account manager. And they can put you in touch with the sector manager for retail